Some sounds can break your heart before you even know what they are. For Clara Hawthorne, that sound was a baby's cry echoing through the Kentucky mountains at dawn. Clara had lived alone in these hills for 20 years, far from the world that once hurt her so deeply. She knew every path, every creek, every hidden valley. The mountains had become her refuge, after losing everything that mattered, but this morning was different. As the sun pushed through the morning mist, she heard something impossible, a desperate cry coming from the wilderness. There, beside a rushing stream, was an abandoned baby, wrapped in rough cloth. The moment Clara picked up that child, her quiet life was over. The baby's face stirred memories she thought were buried forever. Soon, whispers would reach her from town about a wealthy family who lost their heir under mysterious circumstances. Clara had no idea that caring for this abandoned child would drag her back into a world of secrets, betrayal, and dangerous family feuds. What could drive someone to leave an innocent baby alone in the mountains? And why does this child's identity threaten to destroy everything Clara has built? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rough cloth wrapped around. The baby felt familiar beneath Clara's weathered fingers, the kind of weave her grandmother used to make on the old loom that still sat gathering dust in the cabin's back room. But as she cradled the infant against her chest, walking carefully along the narrow deer path that led home, Clara's mind wasn't on textiles. It was on the chain around her neck, where Thomas's wedding ring had hung for 20 years, growing warm against her skin with each step. She hadn't planned on going to the creek that morning. Her usual routine involved checking the rabbit snares first, then tending to her small vegetable garden behind the cabin. But something had pulled her toward the water, maybe the restless energy that came with the changing season, or maybe something deeper that she couldn't name. Now, holding this tiny stranger, Clara wondered if some force beyond her understanding had guided her there. The baby had stopped crying once she picked him up, but his eyes remained alert, following her face with an intensity that seemed unusual for an infant. Those eyes were a striking shade of blue-green, like the deep pools found in limestone caves. Clara found herself talking to him as she walked, her voice rusty from years of speaking mainly to herself and the occasional wild animal. "Well now, little one, what's your story?" she murmured, adjusting the bundle to get a better look at his face. "Someone left you out there like you were nothing more than a sack of grain. That doesn't sit right with me, not one bit." The path to her cabin wound through a grove of ancient oaks, their leaves just beginning to turn the deep gold and crimson that marked autumn in these mountains. Clara had walked this route thousands of times over the past 2 decades, but today it felt different, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. The baby's weight in her arms was both comforting and terrifying. She hadn't held a child since. Clara pushed that thought away before it could take root. Some memories were too painful to revisit, even after all these years. Her cabin came into view through the trees, a sturdy structure built from local timber and fieldstone. Thomas had started building it the year before he died, dreaming of a simple life away from the complications of town. Clara had finished the work herself, driven by grief and the need to honor his vision. Over the years, she'd added a workshop, a root cellar, and a small barn for the goats and chickens that provided her with milk, eggs, and the occasional meat. Inside, the cabin was warm and practical, furnished with pieces Thomas had made, and others Clara had crafted herself during the long winter months. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel holding a few precious photographs and mementos from her previous life. The kitchen was simple but efficient, with shelves lined with preserved foods and herbs she'd gathered from the mountains. Clara settled into the rocking chair by the window, the same chair where she'd spent countless evenings reading or working on quilts. The baby seemed content in her arms, his tiny fist grasping at the air near her face. She studied his features more carefully now, noting the strong jawline and the way his dark hair curled at the temples. There was something aristocratic about his bone structure, something that spoke of good breeding and careful genetics. "You're not from around here, are you?" she said softly, touching his cheek with one finger. "This old mountain woman can tell quality when she sees it, and you've got the look of fine stock about you." The baby made a small sound, somewhere between a sigh and a coo, and Clara felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of solitude she'd carried for so long. She tried to tell herself it was just maternal instinct, a biological response that any woman might have to a helpless infant. But deep down she knew it was more than that. This child had awakened something in her that she'd thought was dead and buried with Thomas and their own baby all those years ago. As the morning wore on, Clara found herself falling into a rhythm of care that felt both foreign and natural. She warmed some goat's milk and fed the baby with a small spoon, marveling at how readily he accepted the nourishment. She changed the rough cloth that served as a diaper, fashioning a better one from an old soft shirt. All the while, she talked to him, her voice growing stronger and more confident with each passing hour. "I suppose you'll be needing a name," she said, settling back into the rocking chair after his feeding. "Can't just keep calling you baby forever. Though I reckon we should figure out where you belong before we get too attached to each other." But even as she said the words, Clara knew it was already too late for that. The baby had claimed a piece of her heart the moment she'd lifted him from beside the creek. Whatever his story was, whatever circumstances had led to his abandonment, she was now part of it whether she liked it or not. The afternoon sun slanted through the cabin windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Clara had always found comfort in the changing light, the way it marked the passage of time without the harsh insistence of clocks or schedules. But today she felt restless, aware that decisions would need to be made soon. She couldn't keep a baby without supplies, diapers, proper formula, clothes that fit. And that meant a trip to Cedar Hollow, the small town nestled in the valley below her mountain sanctuary. Clara hadn't been to town in nearly 6 months, and before that her visits had been brief and purely functional, buying supplies, selling the crafts and preserved foods that provided her modest income, avoiding conversations that might lead to questions about her solitary life. The thought of walking into Milliken's general store with a baby in her arms made her stomach tighten with anxiety. But as she looked down at the sleeping infant, his face peaceful and trusting in the golden afternoon light, Clara knew she had no choice. Whatever secrets this child carried, whatever dangers might be following in his wake, she was committed now. The chain around her neck felt heavier suddenly, Thomas's ring pressing against her skin like a reminder of all she'd lost and all she might yet lose again. "Tomorrow," she whispered to the baby, her voice barely audible above the soft crackle of the fire. "Tomorrow, we'll go down to town and see what we can learn about you, little one. But tonight, you're safe here with me." Outside, the mountain wind picked up, rustling through the oak leaves with a sound like whispered warnings. Clara pulled a quilt over both herself and the baby, settling deeper into the rocking chair. For the first time in 20 years, she wasn't alone in her sanctuary. And the feeling was both wonderful and terrifying. As darkness fell over the mountains, Clara found herself humming an old lullaby her mother had sung to her long ago. The baby stirred at the sound, but didn't wake, his small body warm and solid against her chest. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight was theirs, a moment of peace before the world intruded on their fragile new bond. The fire burned lower, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and Clara continued to rock, her mind already turning over the questions that would need answers. Who was this child? Why had someone abandoned him in such a remote place? And why did holding him feel like coming home after a lifetime of wandering in the wilderness? The wedding ring pressed against her skin, a tangible link to her past, while the baby in her arms represented something she'd never dared to hope for again. Future worth fighting for, Clara had forgotten how intrusive the world could be until she walked into Milliken's general store, with the baby bundled in her arms. The bell above the door announced her arrival with a harsh jangle that seemed to echo through every corner of the cramped space. And within seconds, every eye in the store was fixed on her with undisguised curiosity. "Well, I'll be damned," said Harley Milliken from behind the counter, his graying beard unable to hide his shocked expression. "Clara Hawthorne, as I live and breathe. Ain't seen you down here since, when was it? Spring sometime?" "Harley," Clara nodded curtly, adjusting the baby's weight in her arms. She'd wrapped him in her cleanest quilt, but she could feel the stares of the other customers drilling into her back like accusations. "I need some supplies." Mrs. Patterson, the town's self-appointed keeper of gossip, stepped closer with the predatory smile of someone who'd just spotted fresh prey. "Why, Clara, honey, what do you have there?" Her voice carried the false sweetness that barely concealed her hunger for scandal. "Baby needs some things," Clara replied, keeping her voice level as she approached the counter where Harley kept the infant supplies. The selection was limited. Cedar Hollow wasn't the kind of place that catered to young families, but she could see diapers, formula, and a few basic necessities. "Baby?" Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows shot up toward her dyed hairline. "Clara, dear, whose baby is that?" "I mean, you've been living up on that mountain by yourself for—" "That's my business," Clara cut her off. But she could see the wheels turning in the older woman's head, already composing the story she'd spread through town before sunset. Harley, sensing the tension, busied himself gathering the items Clara pointed out. "You'll need bottles too," he said quietly, "and some of those little undershirts. Gets cold up your way." As Clara selected what she needed, trying to ignore the whispered conversation sprouting up around her like weeds after rain, she became aware of another discussion taking place near the penny candy counter. Two men in expensive suits, unusual attire for Cedar Hollow, were speaking in low, urgent tones to Sheriff Morrison. "Family's been through enough," one of the suited men was saying. "All we want is closure, some kind of resolution to this tragedy." Sheriff Morrison, a decent man who'd held his position for nearly 30 years, looked uncomfortable. "I understand your concern, Mr. Davidson, but without more evidence, the heir is gone," the second suit interrupted. "Car went off Devil's Backbone Ridge 3 nights ago. Nothing left but twisted metal," and he glanced around and lowered his voice further, Clara's hands stilled on a package of diapers. Devil's Backbone Ridge was only 10 miles from where she'd found the baby. The timing made her stomach clench with sudden understanding. "Could have been an accident," Sheriff Morrison was saying, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it himself. "The Whitmore family needs to know what happened to their grandchild," Davidson replied. "That baby was supposed to inherit everything. The old man died just 2 weeks ago, and now the whole fortune's in question," the sheriff finished grimly. Clara forced herself to continue shopping, but her mind was racing. The Whitmore family. She knew that name, though she couldn't immediately place why it felt familiar. Old mountain families had long memories, and the name stirred something in the depths of hers, like silt disturbed in a clear stream. "Will that be all?" Harley asked, his voice carefully neutral, as he tallied her purchases. Clara nodded, then hesitated. "Harley, that accident up on Devil's Backbone, when did you say it happened?" His eyes flicked toward the suited men, then back to her. 3 nights ago, during that storm we had. Terrible thing. Young couple with their baby, visiting from back east. Car just went right off the road." He leaned closer and lowered his voice. "Though between you and me, Clara, that road's treacherous but not impossible. Takes more than bad weather to send a car clean over that guardrail." The baby stirred in Clara's arms, making a small sound that drew Mrs. Patterson's attention like a magnet to iron. "Oh, my stars," she breathed, edging closer. "Clara, that's a newborn if I ever saw one. Where on earth did you—" Her words died as she got a clear look at the baby's face. The color drained from her cheeks so fast Clara thought she might faint. "Mrs. Patterson, you feeling all right?" "Those eyes," the older woman whispered. "That chin." "My lord, Clara, where did you find this child?" Before Clara could answer, one of the suited men approached them. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice smooth but with an undertone that raised the hair on Clara's neck. "Couldn't help but notice your baby." "Beautiful child? Mind if I ask his name?" Clara's instincts, honed by 20 years of mountain living, screamed danger. "I mind," she said firmly, gathering her purchases with one arm while holding the baby protectively with the other. The man's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Of course. Just that we're looking for a missing child, and this ain't your missing child, Clara said, backing toward the door. This baby's been with me since he was born. It was a lie, and from the way the man's eyes narrowed, he knew it. But Clara had learned long ago that sometimes lies were the only shield between innocence and evil. Is that so? The man reached into his jacket and Clara tensed, but he only produced a business card. James Davidson, representing the Whitmore estate. If you should happen to hear anything about a missing infant, I won't, Clara said flatly, pushing through the door with her purchases. But she could feel his eyes on her as she loaded her supplies into the old truck Thomas had left behind. The baby began to fuss, and as she tried to soothe him, her hand brushed against something hidden beneath the rough outer blanket she'd found him in. Something that felt like Clara's breath caught fabric, fine, expensive fabric that felt like silk beneath her calloused fingers. With shaking hands, she carefully peeled back the rough outer layer, revealing an inner blanket of cream-colored cashmere embroidered with delicate blue thread. The initials SW were stitched in one corner, with the kind of precision that spoke of expensive craftsmanship. SW. The Whitmore baby had been named Samuel, according to the whispered conversation she'd overheard. Samuel Whitmore. Clara's heart pounded as she stared down at the child in her arms, the child she now realized was worth more than she could imagine, and whose very existence put them both in mortal danger. Someone had wrapped this expensive baby in rough mountain cloth to disguise his identity, then left him where any wild animal could have found him. Someone had wanted Samuel Whitmore to disappear forever, but why? And who had tried to save him by placing him where Clara would find him? The baby, Samuel, looked up at her with those striking blue-green eyes, and Clara felt the last of her resistance crumble. Whatever game was being played, whatever fortunes were at stake, this innocent child was now her responsibility. The expensive blanket proved he was exactly who she'd begun to suspect, but it also proved that someone powerful wanted him dead. SW, she whispered, touching the embroidered initials. Samuel Whitmore. Oh, little one, what have you gotten us into? As she drove back up the mountain road, Clara's mind raced through possibilities and plans. She couldn't take him to the authorities, not when Davidson and his associate were clearly watching for any sign of the missing heir. She couldn't return him to his family when that family might be the very people who wanted him gone. And she couldn't simply run. Where would a 60-year-old mountain woman go with a stolen baby? The truck bounced over the familiar ruts of her private road, but for the first time in 20 years, Clara didn't feel safe in her mountain sanctuary. Samuel Whitmore wasn't just any abandoned baby. He was the key to a fortune, and someone had already tried to kill him once. Now she was the only thing standing between him and whoever wanted him dead. As she pulled up to her cabin, Clara noticed fresh tire tracks in the soft earth near her mailbox. Someone had been here while she was gone, someone driving a vehicle much newer and heavier than her old truck. The tracks led up to her house, then back down again, as if the driver had taken a careful look around before leaving. Looks like we've got company coming. Samuel, she said softly, gathering the baby and her supplies. But don't you worry none. This old mountain woman has dealt with worse things than city folk in fancy suits. Still, as she settled Samuel into the makeshift crib she'd fashioned from a dresser drawer, Clara's hand went instinctively to the chain around her neck. Thomas's ring felt warm against her palm, and she found herself making a promise to both the living and the dead. I won't let them hurt you, she whispered to the sleeping baby. Whatever it costs me, whoever they are, they won't get their hands on you. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows with an urgency that seemed to echo Clara's growing fear. Somewhere in the darkness beyond her porch light, powerful people were making plans that involved the child now sleeping peacefully in her care. She had no money, no connections, no allies she could call upon, but she had 20 years of mountain survival skills. Her mother's protective instincts awakened from their long slumber, and the memory of injustices that had never been answered. Sometimes, Clara thought as she checked the locks on her doors for the first time in decades, that was enough to move mountains, or at least to protect one very small, very precious child from those who would do him harm. The Cedar Hollow Public Library occupied a converted Victorian house on Maple Street, its shelves filled with donated books and decades of local newspapers that few people bothered to read anymore. Clara hadn't set foot in the building since Thomas's death, but desperate times called for desperate measures. With Samuel sleeping peacefully in a sling across her chest, she climbed the creaking front steps just as the morning sun cleared the surrounding hills. Margaret Henley looked up from her desk with surprise that quickly melted into genuine warmth. The librarian had aged considerably since Clara last saw her, her grey hair now completely white and new lines mapping the years around her kind eyes. "Clara Hawthorne," Margaret said softly, rising from her chair. "My goodness, it's been too long," Clara finished, adjusting the sling to ensure Samuel remained comfortable. "I need to do some research, Margaret." "About the Whitmore family." Margaret's expression grew cautious. "Research for what purpose, if you don't mind my asking?" Clara had prepared for this question during the sleepless night she'd spent, planning her next moves. "Genealogy project," she said, which wasn't entirely a lie. "Found some old family papers that mentioned connections to local mining families." "I see." Margaret gestured toward the reference section, where bound volumes of newspapers and local histories lined the shelves. "We have quite a bit on the Whitmores. Prominent family going back to the 1800s, coal money mostly." As Margaret pulled several volumes from the shelves, Clara found herself studying the librarian's face. "You remember my family, don't you? The Hawthorns who lived over on Bitter Creek." "Of course I do, honey. Your father worked the mines for nearly 30 years. Margaret's voice grew gentler. "Terrible thing what happened to him." Clara felt Samuel stir against her chest as she opened the first volume of newspaper clippings. "Remind me about the details. It's been so long, and I was just a girl when—" "Mining accident," Margaret said, settling into the chair beside Clara. "Tunnel collapse in the Whitmore operation up on Black Mountain. Your father and 3 other men were killed instantly." The newspaper clipping Margaret pointed to was dated October 15th, 1978, Clara. Read the sparse details. "A tunnel collapse caused by structural failure. 4 men dead. Families compensated by the Whitmore Mining Company as a gesture of goodwill." The article was brief and contained no mention of an investigation or any suggestion of negligence. "Structural failure," Clara murmured, running her finger along the faded newsprint. "What did that mean exactly?" Margaret glanced around the empty library, then leaned closer. "Officially, weak shale, unexpected geological conditions. But there were rumors." She stopped herself, shaking her head. "What kind of rumors?" "Clara, this was 45 years ago. Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie." Samuel made a small sound, and Clara automatically began rocking him gently. "Margaret, I found something in those old family papers. Something that suggests my father might have been planning to—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "To speak to someone about safety conditions before he died." The librarian's face went pale. "Oh, Clara, you shouldn't go digging into things like that. Some stones are better left unturned, but if there's truth to be found—" "Truth?" Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. "The truth is that your father was asking questions about corner cutting and safety violations. The truth is that he documented unsafe conditions and was planning to take his concerns to the State Mining Board. The truth is that tunnel didn't collapse by accident." Clara's blood turned to ice water in her veins. "You knew this. All these years you knew my father was murdered?" "I suspected," Margaret corrected, her hands trembling as she closed the newspaper volume. "But suspecting and knowing are different things, and the Whitmores had enough money and influence to make sure their version of events became the official story." "What about the other families? The men who died with my father?" "One family moved away within a month of the accident. Another took a substantial settlement and signed papers agreeing never to discuss the details. The third," Margaret's voice caught, "the third family lost their oldest son in a hunting accident 2 weeks after the funeral. Sometimes coincidences pile up until they stop looking like coincidences. Clara felt Samuel's tiny hand grasp her finger through the sling, and the innocent trust in that gesture strengthened her resolve. I need to see everything you have on the Whitmores. Recent stuff, too. I heard there was another death recently. Old Jeremiah Whitmore passed 2 weeks ago, Margaret confirmed, pulling out more recent newspaper files. Richest man in 3 counties, they say. Left behind quite a complicated situation. The obituary painted Jeremiah Whitmore as a pillar of the community, generous philanthropist, successful businessman, devoted family man. But between the lines, Clara could read the suggestion of family conflicts and disputed inheritances. The article mentioned his son Charles, who had predeceased him in a tragic automobile accident, and his grandson Samuel, described as the sole heir to the Whitmore legacy. Charles died 3 nights ago, Margaret said quietly. Devil's Backbone Ridge. Car went right off the road during that storm. Clara's pulse quickened. Was he alone? No, he was with his wife and baby. The car caught fire. Terrible thing. They're saying no one could have survived. They found bodies. Margaret gave her a sharp look. Why would you ask that? Clara forced herself to remain calm. Just seems like an awful lot of tragedy for one family to bear. That's true enough. Margaret pulled out another clipping, this one from just yesterday's paper. This might interest you too. About the estate, the article was brief but revealing. With Charles Whitmore dead, the entire family fortune would pass to his infant son, Samuel. But there were complications. Charles's brother William had contested the will, claiming that the baby had also died in the crash, and that he, as the next surviving heir, should inherit everything. $50 million, Margaret whispered. That's what they're saying the estate is worth. Mining rights, real estate investments, all of it hanging on whether that baby survived the crash. Clara's hand moved protectively to Samuel's back. The child in her arms wasn't just an abandoned infant. He was worth $50 million. And his uncle was apparently willing to claim he was dead to get his hands on the money. Margaret, Clara said carefully, hypothetically speaking, if someone wanted to make sure a particular version of events became the official story, how might they go about it? The librarian's eyes grew troubled. Same way they did 45 years ago, I imagine. Money talks, and the Whitmores have always had plenty to say. Clara spent the next hour reading through decades of newspaper coverage, building a picture of a family that had accumulated wealth and power through methods that weren't always entirely legal or ethical. Mining accidents that were never properly investigated. Environmental violations that resulted in modest fines rather than criminal charges. Workers who raised safety concerns and then mysteriously lost their jobs or suffered unfortunate accidents. But she also found something else. A small article from 1978, published just a week before her father's death. It mentioned that several miners at the Whitmore operation had approached the state mining board with concerns about safety violations. The article didn't name the miners, but it quoted a company spokesman as saying the complaints were frivolous and motivated by labor disputes. Margaret, Clara said, her voice tight with emotion, do you think my father was one of the miners mentioned in this article? The librarian looked at the clipping and sighed. Clara, honey, I think your father was exactly the kind of man who would risk his job to protect his fellow workers. And I think that's what got him killed. Samuel stirred in the sling, his tiny fist working against Clara's chest. Looking down at him, Clara felt the weight of history pressing against the present. 2 generations of Whitmores had been willing to kill to protect their interests. Now she was holding the key to their entire fortune, and they had no idea he was still alive. Thank you, Margaret, Clara said, carefully gathering the newspaper clippings she'd been reading. This has been very enlightening. Clara, the librarian caught her arm as she started to leave. Be careful. Whatever you're thinking of doing, remember that these people have more money and power than you can imagine. They've gotten away with murder before. Clara looked down at Samuel's peaceful face, then back at Margaret. Maybe it's time someone made sure they didn't get away with it again. As she walked back to her truck, Clara's mind was already working through the implications of what she'd learned. Samuel wasn't just an abandoned baby, he was a target. His uncle William needed him dead to claim the inheritance, and given the family's history, William wouldn't hesitate to finish what the car crash had apparently failed to accomplish. But Clara also realized something else. She wasn't just a random mountain woman who'd happened to find an abandoned baby. She was the daughter of a man the Whitmores had murdered to protect their secrets. This wasn't coincidence. This was justice demanding to be served. 45 years late, but not a moment too soon, Samuel's tiny hand moved against her chest, and Clara made a silent promise to both him and her father's memory. The Whitmores had been getting away with murder for decades, but their time was finally running out. That evening, as Clara prepared Samuel's bottle by the warm glow of the kitchen lamp, she found herself speaking aloud to the baby in a way that felt both natural and necessary. "You need a name I can call you, without feeling like I'm announcing to the world who you are," she said, testing the temperature of the goat's milk against her wrist. "Samuel's a fine name, but it carries too much weight right now." The baby watched her with those remarkable eyes, and Clara felt her heart constrict with an emotion she'd thought was buried forever. "How about I call you Sam? Simple, honest. Like my Samuel would have been if—" She stopped herself, swallowing hard against the old pain. Her Samuel had lived only 3 days, born too early in a winter storm that kept them from reaching the hospital in time. Thomas had carved a tiny headstone that still stood in the family cemetery up the hill, weathered by 40 years of mountain seasons. That loss had nearly destroyed her marriage, and had certainly destroyed her faith in her ability to protect anything small and precious. But this Sam, this living, breathing child who reached for her with perfect trust, felt like a second chance she'd never dared to hope for. "Sam it is then," she whispered, settling into the rocking chair to feed him. "And Sam, we need to talk about our situation." As if he understood the gravity of her tone, the baby's eyes remained fixed on her face while he drank. Clara found herself telling him everything. About his real family, about the danger they were both in, about her father's death and the web of corruption that seemed to connect past and present like threads in a dark tapestry. "Your Uncle William wants you dead," she said matter-of-factly. "Probably hired someone to cause that car crash, then sent them to make sure the job was finished. But they didn't count on whoever saved you, someone with a conscience who couldn't follow through with killing a baby." Sam made a small sound around the bottle, and Clara smiled despite their circumstances. "You're a good listener. That's going to serve you well in life, assuming we can keep you alive long enough to grow up." The humor died as quickly as it had come. Clara had been thinking about their options all day, and none of them were particularly encouraging. She couldn't go to the police. Davidson's presence at the sheriff's office suggested the family had official channels well in hand. She couldn't simply run with Sam. Where would a 60-year-old woman go with a baby that half the state would soon be looking for? And she couldn't give him back to his family when that family clearly wanted him dead, which left only one option. She had to prove that William Whitmore was behind the deaths of Sam's parents. And she had to do it before he realized his nephew was still alive. After settling Sam in his makeshift crib, Clara climbed the narrow stairs to the cabin's loft, where she kept the boxes of belongings that had survived her previous life. Most of Thomas's things were there, along with family photographs and documents she hadn't looked at in years. But tonight, she was looking for something specific. The box of her father's belongings that her mother had saved after his death. She found it beneath an old quilt, still wrapped in the brown paper and twine her mother had used 45 years ago. Clara's hands shook as she untied the knots. She'd been only 17 when her father died, too young and too devastated to pay attention to the adult conversations about investigations and settlements. But her mother had been meticulous about keeping records, and Clara was betting some of those records might still exist. The box contained exactly what she'd hoped to find: her father's final pay stubs, safety violation reports he'd filed with the company, and most importantly, a letter he'd written to the state mining board just 3 days before his death. Clara read the letter by lamplight, her father's careful handwriting bringing his voice back across the decades. He documented 17 separate safety violations in the weeks before the tunnel collapse, ranging from inadequate ventilation to improper support structures. The letter was formal and respectful, but it painted a clear picture of a mining operation that was cutting corners at the expense of worker safety. "They knew," Clara whispered to the sleeping baby downstairs. "Your family knew the tunnel was dangerous, and they let men work there anyway, because fixing it would have cost money." But the letter was more than just a safety report. In the final paragraph, her father had written something that made Clara's blood run cold. "I have reason to believe that these violations are not accidental oversights, but deliberate cost-cutting measures implemented at the direction of management. I have documentation to support this claim, and am prepared to provide it to state investigators." Documentation. Her father had evidence of deliberate negligence, evidence that would have exposed the Whitmores as the criminals they were, evidence that had died with him in that tunnel collapse, or had it. Clara spent the next hour going through every piece of paper in the box, looking for any clue about where her father might have hidden his evidence. She found receipts, work schedules, and safety reports, but nothing that qualified as the kind of documentation that would threaten a family's entire empire. Then, tucked into the back of an old wallet, she found something that made her heart stop: a safety deposit box key. The key was small and brass, attached to a paper tag with the words "First National Bank" written in her father's careful script. Clara stared at it for a long moment, her mind racing through possibilities. Her father had rented a safety deposit box just weeks before his death, a box that might still contain the evidence he died trying to protect. A sound from outside made Clara freeze. The soft crunch of gravel under careful footsteps, as if someone was trying to approach the cabin without being heard. She quickly gathered the papers back into the box and crept to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the clearing around her cabin. At first she saw nothing unusual. Then a shadow moved near the tree line, too large and deliberate to be an animal. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she made her way downstairs, moving as quietly as possible. Sam was still sleeping peacefully, unaware that danger was circling their sanctuary, like wolves around a campfire. Another sound, closer this time. The soft thud of a boot against the cabin's front steps. Clara grabbed the shotgun from the rack beside the door, checking to make sure it was loaded. She'd learned to shoot as a child and had kept her skills sharp during her years of mountain living. But she'd never imagined she'd need to defend herself against anything more dangerous than the occasional black bear. The footsteps stopped directly outside her door. Clara held her breath, finger resting lightly on the trigger, waiting for the knock that would announce a visitor or the sound of someone trying to force entry. Instead, she heard the soft rustle of paper being slid under the door. Clara waited a full 5 minutes after the footsteps retreated before approaching the door. A white envelope lay on the floor, her name written across it in block letters. With the shotgun still in one hand, she picked up the envelope and tore it open. The message inside was brief and chilling. "Mind your own business or the baby pays the price. You have been warned." Clara's hands shook as she read the words again. Someone knew about Sam. Someone knew she'd been asking questions about the Whitmore family. And someone was willing to threaten an innocent child to keep their secrets buried. But the threat also told her something important. They weren't ready to kill her yet. If they'd wanted her dead, they could have shot her through the window or burned down the cabin while she slept. The fact that they'd chosen intimidation over violence suggested they were still trying to handle the situation quietly. That gave her an advantage, small though it might be. Clara barricaded the door with a heavy dresser and checked all the windows, making sure they were securely latched. Then she settled into the rocking chair with the shotgun across her knees, watching over Sam while her mind worked through their options. The safety deposit box key felt warm in her palm. If her father had managed to hide evidence of Whitmore corruption, it might be their only hope of survival. Evidence that could expose William Whitmore's crimes and protect Sam from those who wanted him dead. But getting to that evidence would mean leaving the safety of the mountains and venturing into a world where the Whitmores held most of the cards. It would mean trusting that a 45-year-old safety deposit box still existed and that whatever was inside would be enough to bring down a family that had been getting away with murder for decades. "What do you think, Sam?" she whispered to the sleeping baby. "Should we take the gamble, or should we run for the hills and hope they never find us?" Sam stirred in his sleep, his tiny fist opening and closing as if he were grasping for something just out of reach. Looking at him, Clara felt the last of her uncertainty fade away. She'd spent 20 years hiding from the world, 20 years letting injustice go unanswered because confronting it seemed too dangerous, too difficult, too likely to end in heartbreak. But this child deserved better than a life spent running and hiding. He deserved the truth about his family, justice for his parents' murder, and the inheritance that was rightfully his. And maybe, just maybe, her father deserved justice too. "Tomorrow we're going to town, Sam," Clara said softly, her voice steady with newfound resolve. "We're going to find out what my daddy knew about your family. And then we're going to make sure the whole world knows it too." Outside, the mountain wind whistled through the trees, carrying with it the promise of change. For the first time in 20 years, Clara Hawthorne was ready to fight back against the forces that had shaped her life. And this time, she had something worth fighting for, sleeping peacefully in her arms. The threatening note lay crumpled on the floor beside her chair. But Clara no longer felt afraid. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford when an innocent child's life hung in the balance. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new challenges, new opportunities for everything to go wrong. But tonight, she and Sam were safe in their mountain sanctuary, and that was enough. The storm was coming, but Clara Hawthorne had weathered storms before. This time, she intended to be the one who decided how it ended. Dawn came grey and cold, with the kind of mist that clung to the mountains like smoke from an old fire. Clara had slept little, listening for sounds that might herald another midnight visit, but the threatening note seemed to have been the extent of their nighttime caller's boldness. Now, with Sam fed and bundled warmly against the morning chill, she was preparing to take the biggest risk of her 20 years on the mountain. The storage shed behind her cabin held the remnants of her previous life, items too precious to discard, but too painful to keep in daily sight. Thomas's tools hung neatly on hooks, their metal surfaces showing only the faintest traces of rust despite decades of disuse. His fishing gear occupied one corner, while boxes of photographs and documents lined the walls like silent sentinels guarding memories. But it was the metal trunk in the far corner that drew Clara's attention this morning. She'd avoided opening it for years, knowing that what lay inside would bring back the worst day of her life. Now, with Sam sleeping peacefully in his carrier beside her, she found the strength to lift the heavy lid. The smell of old leather and faded paper rose from the trunk's depths, carrying with it the ghost of her father's presence. His mining helmet sat on top, its once bright yellow surface now dulled by age, but still intact. Clara lifted it carefully, her fingers tracing the dents and scratches that told the story of 30 years spent underground. "He wore this every day for 3 decades, she said softly to Sam, though the baby was too young to understand. Kept it polished and checked the light religiously. Said a man's helmet was what stood between him and the darkness. Beneath the helmet lay the rest of her father's mining gear, his lunch pail, still dented from the collapse that killed him, his work clothes, carefully folded by her mother's loving hands, and a canvas bag that Clara had never bothered to examine closely before. She opened the bag with trembling fingers, revealing a collection of papers and photographs that made her breath catch. These weren't the official documents she'd found in his personal effects. These were photocopies of company memos, safety inspection reports that had been filed but never acted upon, and photographs of mining conditions that told a story of deliberate negligence. One photograph in particular made Clara's blood run cold. It showed the tunnel where her father had died, taken just days before the collapse. The support beams were clearly inadequate for the size of the excavation, and water stains on the walls indicated serious drainage, problems that should have shut down the operation immediately. But it was the memo attached to the photograph that truly revealed the scope of the Whitmore family's crimes. Dated 2 weeks before the collapse, it was from Charles Whitmore Sr., William and Charles Jr.'s father, to the mine foreman. Cost overruns on Tunnel 7 are unacceptable. Reduce support materials by 30% and eliminate unnecessary safety measures. Production quotas must be met regardless of worker complaints. Clara read the memo 3 times, her anger building with each word. Her father and 3 other men had died because Charles Whitmore Sr. wanted to save money on safety equipment. They'd been murdered for the sake of a company's profit margin. "Your grandfather was a killer," she whispered to Sam, her voice shaking with emotion. "Just like your uncle. It runs in the family, doesn't it?" But as she continued searching through the bag, Clara found something that gave her hope. At the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, was a small notebook filled with her father's careful handwriting. Page after page documented safety violations, cost-cutting measures, and conversations with supervisors who ordered dangerous shortcuts to increase production. The final entry, dated the day before the collapse, contained information that made Clara's heart race. Spoke with Danny Kowalski from the State Mining Board. "He's agreed to meet me next week to review all documentation. Said if evidence is as strong as I claim, State will file criminal charges against company management. Finally going to get justice for all the men who've been hurt by Whitmore greed." Danny Kowalski. Clara remembered that name from the newspaper clippings she'd read yesterday. He'd been the state mining inspector who'd investigated her father's death, the one who'd ruled it an accident despite the obvious evidence of negligence. Either Kowalski had been bought off by the Whitmores, or he'd never received the evidence her father had died trying to protect. Clara carefully rewrapped the notebook and photographs, her mind already working through the implications. This evidence was 45 years old, but criminal cases involving willful negligence and workplace deaths had no statute of limitations. If she could get this information to the right people, honest investigators who couldn't be intimidated or bought, it might finally bring justice for her father's death. More importantly, it might provide the leverage she needed to protect Sam from his murderous uncle. A sound from outside made Clara freeze, the distant rumble of an engine making its way up her private road. She quickly closed the trunk and gathered Sam into her arms. Moving to the window, where she could observe the approaching vehicle without being seen, the black SUV that pulled into her clearing was expensive and out of place among the mountain surroundings. Its windows were tinted dark, making it impossible to see who was inside. But Clara counted at least 3 figures when the doors opened. James Davidson stepped out first, straightening his suit jacket as he surveyed the cabin with calculating eyes. He was followed by 2 men Clara didn't recognize, large, professional-looking men whose movements suggested military or law enforcement training. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Davidson called out, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "We know you're in there. We just want to talk." Clara checked the shotgun's load one more time, then positioned herself where she could see the approaching men without exposing herself to gunfire. "Talk from where you are," she called back. "I can hear you just fine." "We have a proposition for you," Davidson continued, stopping about 20 feet from her front porch. "A generous offer that could solve all your problems." "I don't have any problems that need solving." Davidson's laugh was cold and humorless. "I think you do, Mrs. Hawthorne. I think you have a very big problem sleeping in your house right now." Clara's grip tightened on the shotgun. They knew about Sam. Any pretense that this was a coincidental visit was gone. The Whitmore family is prepared to offer you $100,000 for the safe return of their missing grandchild, Davidson announced. "Cash, no questions asked, no legal complications. You can take the money and disappear, start a new life anywhere you want. And if I refuse, then we'll have to explore other options. Options that might not be so pleasant for either you or the baby." Clara felt Sam stir against her chest, his tiny movements reminding her of what was at stake. $100,000 was more money than she'd see in a lifetime, enough to disappear completely and raise Sam somewhere the Whitmores could never find them. But it was also an admission of guilt. Davidson wouldn't be offering that kind of money for the return of an abandoned baby unless Sam's identity was worth far more than $100,000. "I need time to think about it," Clara called out. "You have until sunset," Davidson replied. "After that, the offer expires, and we handle this situation differently." The three men climbed back into their SUV and drove away, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts and a sleeping baby, who represented both her greatest joy and her most dangerous burden. She looked down at Sam's peaceful face, then at the evidence of Whitmore crimes that lay scattered around the storage shed. 2 generations of that family had gotten away with murder, had bought their way out of consequences with money and intimidation. But this time was different. This time, they'd made the mistake of threatening something Clara cared about more than her own life. "What do you say, Sam?" she whispered to the sleeping baby. "Ready to show your uncle what mountain justice looks like?" The First National Bank of Cedar Hollow occupied a brick building that had stood on Main Street since 1923, its marble floors and brass fixtures speaking of an era when banks were built to project permanence and trustworthiness. Clara hadn't set foot inside since Thomas's death, when she'd closed their joint accounts and retreated to her mountain sanctuary. Now, with Sam sleeping peacefully in his carrier and her father's safety deposit box key burning like a coal in her pocket, she approached the teller window with the kind of nervous energy that came from crossing a bridge there was no going back over. "Can I help you?" asked the young woman behind the counter, her name tag identifying her as Jessica. "I need to access a safety deposit box," Clara said, producing the key and an old piece of identification. "Box number 247. Jessica examined the key and Clara's driver's license, her brow furrowing with concentration. "This box was rented in 1978, she said. "The rental fees haven't been paid in—" She stopped, consulting her computer screen. "Actually, it looks like the fees were paid in advance. 47 years in advance." Clara's eyebrows rose. Her father had paid nearly 50 years of rental fees in advance. That suggested he'd expected the box to remain undisturbed for decades, hidden away, until someone came looking for what he'd left behind. "I'll need to verify your identity and relationship to the box holder," Jessica continued. "Can you wait here while I get my supervisor?" While Jessica disappeared into the back offices, Clara found herself studying the other customers in the bank. A few elderly residents conducting routine business, a young mother with 2 small children, a businessman in an expensive suit who kept glancing at his watch. Nothing that seemed threatening, but Clara's mountain-honed instincts told her to remain alert. "Mrs. Hawthorne?" An older man approached, extending his hand. "I'm Robert Chen, branch manager. I understand you're here about one of our oldest safety deposit boxes." "That's right. It belonged to my father, Daniel Hawthorne." Chen's expression grew thoughtful. "I remember your father. I was just starting here when he opened that box. Very serious man, very concerned about protecting important documents." He paused, studying Clara's face. "He said someone would come for it eventually. Said I know them, because they'd have the same eyes." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. Her father had somehow known that one day she would need what he'd hidden in that box. "Let me escort you to the vault," Chen said, gesturing toward a heavy door at the rear of the bank. "I have to warn you, though, we've had some unusual inquiries about that particular box recently." "What kind of inquiries?" "Someone claiming to represent the estate of a deceased customer, asking about unclaimed boxes. They seemed very interested in boxes opened around the time your father's was established." Chen's voice dropped lower as they walked. "I didn't provide any information, of course. Banking privacy laws are very strict. The vault was small and windowless, lined with hundreds of numbered boxes in various sizes. Chen used both his master key and Clara's key to open box 247, sliding out a long metal container that was heavier than Clara had expected. "I'll leave you alone to examine the contents," Chen said diplomatically. "Take all the time you need." Clara waited until she heard his footsteps retreat before lifting the lid of the metal box. Inside was a manila envelope thick with documents. several small objects wrapped in cloth, and a letter addressed to my daughter Clara in her father's careful handwriting. With trembling hands, Clara opened the letter first. "Clara, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and the truth needs to come out. The Whitmores have been killing men for profit for 20 years, and I have the evidence to prove it. But more than that, I've discovered something about our family's connection to theirs that you need to know. Your great-grandmother was a Whitmore. She was disowned by the family when she married a poor miner, but that makes you and any children you might have legitimate heirs to a portion of the Whitmore fortune. I've included the genealogical records that prove it. The Whitmores have built their empire on blood money. It's time someone with clean hands claimed what's rightfully theirs and used it to help the families they've destroyed. Be careful, daughter. These people will kill to protect their secrets. All my love, Daddy." Clara read the letter 3 times before its implications fully sank in. She wasn't just a random mountain woman who'd found an abandoned baby. She was a Whitmore heir herself, someone with a legitimate claim to the family fortune. And Sam was her cousin, separated by several generations, but connected by blood and by a shared right to justice. The documents in the envelope supported her father's claims with meticulous detail. Birth certificates, marriage records, and death certificates that traced an unbroken line from the original Whitmore patriarch to Clara's great-grandmother to Clara herself. Legal papers that established her standing as a legitimate heir, even though the family had tried to erase her bloodline from their history. But it was the other documents that truly revealed the scope of Whitmore criminality. Mining safety reports that had been falsified, payoffs to state inspectors, records of bribes paid to local officials, and most damning of all, a ledger that documented deliberate acts of sabotage designed to eliminate workers who asked too many questions. Her father's death hadn't been the result of corporate negligence. It had been a calculated murder, carried out by men who knew exactly what they were doing. Clara carefully rewrapped each document, her mind racing through the implications. This evidence wouldn't just expose William Whitmore's recent crimes, it would reveal decades of corruption that would destroy the entire family empire and likely send multiple people to prison for the rest of their lives. More importantly, it would establish both her and Sam as legitimate heirs to the Whitmore fortune. Instead of hiding from William's attempts to kill them, she could take the offensive, using the law to protect Sam and claim what was rightfully theirs. But as she prepared to leave the bank, Clara noticed something that made her blood run cold. Through the vault's small window, she could see into the main banking area, where James Davidson was speaking quietly with the branch manager. Robert Chen was shaking his head, gesturing toward the vault, clearly refusing to provide information about Clara's visit. Davidson's 2 associates stood near the front door, positioned to intercept anyone trying to leave. They'd found her. Clara quickly closed the safety deposit box and gathered the documents, her mind racing through options. The bank had a rear exit that led to the alley behind Main Street, but Davidson's men might have that covered too. She was trapped, holding evidence that could destroy the Whitmore family, but unable to get it to safety. Sam began to fuss in his carrier, as if sensing her distress. Clara automatically began rocking him gently, her maternal instincts overriding her fear. Whatever happened next, she would protect this child with her life. Mrs. Hawthorne. Robert Chen appeared in the vault doorway, his face grave. "I'm afraid we have a situation. Some men are here asking about you, and they don't seem inclined to take no for an answer." Clara met his eyes, seeing understanding and sympathy there. "Is there another way out?" Chen nodded slowly. "Follow me." "And Mrs. Hawthorne? Your father was a good man. Whatever he left you, I hope it helps." He led her through a maze of back offices and storage rooms to a service door that opened onto the alley. As Clara stepped into the cool mountain air, she could hear raised voices from the front of the bank, Davidson demanding information that Chen was legally obligated to withhold. "Thank you," Clara whispered, adjusting Sam's carrier as she hurried toward her truck. "Be careful," Chen replied. "Men like that don't give up easily." Clara drove carefully through the back streets of Cedar Hollow, taking a circuitous route to make sure she wasn't being followed. The documents in her bag felt like they were burning a hole through the leather, demanding action, demanding justice. But they also represented something else: hope. For the first time since finding Sam by the creek, Clara felt like she had a real chance of protecting him, not by running or hiding, but by fighting back with weapons the Whitmores had never expected her to possess. "Your great-great-grandmother would be proud," she told Sam as they climbed the winding road back to their mountain sanctuary. "She married for love instead of money, and now her sacrifice is going to bring down the empire that cast her out." Sam made a small sound that Clara chose to interpret as agreement. They were no longer just fugitives running from a powerful family. They were heirs to a fortune built on blood, returning to claim what was rightfully theirs and to ensure that justice was finally served. The war with the Whitmores was about to begin, but this time, Clara had the ammunition she needed to win. Clara spent that evening studying the documents from her father's safety deposit box by lamplight, with Sam sleeping peacefully in his makeshift crib nearby. The evidence was overwhelming. Decades of corporate malfeasance that would not only expose the Whitmore family's crimes, but establish her legal right to claim a portion of their fortune. She was so absorbed in reading that she almost missed the small sound that came from Sam's blanket when she lifted him for his evening feeding. Something small and hard had fallen onto the wooden floor, something that definitely hadn't been there before. Clara carefully examined the blanket, running her fingers along the seams until she found what she was looking for: a tiny slit in the fabric, so expertly sewn that it was nearly invisible. Inside the hidden pocket was a device no bigger than a button, its surface marked with microscopic holes that suggested it was some kind of recording equipment. Clara's hands shook as she held it up to the lamplight, realizing that Sam's blanket had been carrying more than just the baby's identity. It had been carrying evidence. With mounting excitement and dread, Clara connected the device to the old radio in her kitchen, adjusting the frequency until she heard the crackle of recorded voices. What she heard next made her blood turn to ice. "The baby has to disappear permanently," said a voice she now recognized as William Whitmore's. "I don't care how you do it, but make it look like an accident. Something that leaves no trace, no questions." "What about the parents?" asked another voice, younger and more nervous. "Already taken care of. Car went off Devil's Backbone right on schedule. But somehow the baby survived the crash, and now we have a problem. Boss, maybe we should just what?" William's voice turned deadly cold. "Let a baby inherit $50 million, that should be mine. I've waited 30 years for my father to die, and I'm not going to let some infant take what I've earned." There was a pause, then the nervous voice spoke again. "Maria says she can't do it. Won't hurt a baby, no matter how much we pay her. Then Maria has outlived her usefulness. Take care of her after you finish with the child. But she saved the kid from the crash, pulled him out before the car caught fire. She's the only reason he's still alive, exactly why she's a liability. Leave the baby somewhere remote where the animals will finish the job, then make sure Maria has an accident of her own. I want this mess cleaned up before anyone else discovers the child survived." The recording continued for several more minutes, detailing the plan to abandon Sam in the wilderness and eliminate the woman who had saved him from the car crash. Clara listened in horrified fascination as William Whitmore casually ordered the deaths of an innocent baby and the very woman whose conscience had saved Sam's life. But it was the final part of the recording that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. "What about the state investigation into the crash?" the nervous voice asked. "Bought and paid for," William replied with satisfaction. "Sheriff Morrison knows which side his bread is buttered on. Official report will show that all 3 family members died in the accident. No survivors, no questions, no complications. And the inheritance goes to the next legitimate heir, me. By this time next month, I'll control the entire Whitmore empire, and nobody will be able to challenge my claim." Clara sat in stunned silence as the recording ended. William Whitmore hadn't just tried to kill Sam. He'd murdered the baby's parents in cold blood and was planning to eliminate anyone who could threaten his claim to the family fortune. The woman named Maria, whoever she was, had saved Sam from the car crash only to become a target herself for showing mercy. More chilling still was the revelation that Sheriff Morrison was part of the conspiracy. Clara couldn't trust local law enforcement, couldn't rely on official channels for protection or justice. She and Sam were completely on their own, facing enemies with unlimited resources and a willingness to kill anyone who stood in their way. But the recording also gave Clara something she hadn't had before: absolute proof of William's guilt. His own voice, captured on a device that had been hidden in Sam's blanket by someone who knew the truth needed to be preserved. Probably Maria, the mysterious woman who had saved Sam and then helped him disappear into the wilderness where Clara would find him. Clara carefully rewound the recording and played it again, this time making notes about times, dates, and specific details that could be verified. This wasn't just evidence of attempted murder, it was evidence of a conspiracy that included corrupt law enforcement officials and detailed planning for multiple homicides. "Your parents didn't die in an accident," Clara whispered to the sleeping baby. "They were murdered by your uncle, and he's planning to kill you too." But Maria, whoever she is, made sure the truth would survive even if you didn't. The implications were staggering. Sam wasn't just an abandoned baby or even just a missing heir. He was the sole survivor of a family massacre, the only person standing between William Whitmore and complete control of a $50 million empire. No wonder Davidson and his associates were so desperate to find him. But the recording also revealed a crucial weakness in William's plan. He believed Sam was dead, that the baby had perished in the wilderness as intended. As long as Clara could keep Sam's survival secret, she had the advantage of surprise. William would continue acting as though he were the sole heir, making legal moves and public statements that would contradict the truth when Sam's existence was finally revealed. Clara spent the rest of the night making copies of the recording using her old equipment, hiding the duplicates in various locations around the cabin. If something happened to her, if William's men finally tracked them down, at least the evidence would survive to tell the story. But she also realized that her situation had fundamentally changed. She wasn't just protecting an abandoned baby anymore. She was harboring the rightful heir to a fortune, while his would-be killer assumed he was dead. The stakes were higher than she'd imagined, but so was her ability to strike back. As dawn approached, Clara made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. She wasn't going to run or hide anymore. She wasn't going to wait for William Whitmore to discover Sam's survival and come hunting for them. Instead, she was going to take the offensive. Using the evidence her father had gathered and the recording Maria had preserved, Clara was going to expose the Whitmore family's crimes and claim Sam's rightful inheritance. She was going to honor the courage of Maria wherever she was and ensure that the woman's sacrifice hadn't been in vain. "It's time to go home, Sam," Clara said softly, looking down at the sleeping baby who had transformed her life and awakened her long-dormant sense of justice. "Time to claim what's yours and make sure your uncle pays for what he's done." The war was about to begin, but Clara finally had the weapons she needed to win it. William Whitmore had made the mistake of underestimating both the power of a mother's love and the determination of mountain folk who'd been pushed too far. He was about to learn that some battles were fought, not with money or influence, but with truth, courage, and the unbreakable bond between a woman and the child she'd sworn to protect. The next morning brought a clarity that Clara hadn't felt in decades. As she prepared Sam's bottle and watched the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, she found herself thinking not of the dangers that lay ahead, but of the justice that was finally within reach. The recording device had given her everything she needed to destroy William Whitmore. But first, she had to get that evidence to people who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Her first call was to the State Attorney General's office in Frankfurt. using the old landline that still connected her cabin to the outside world. After working her way through several layers of bureaucracy, Clara finally reached Assistant Attorney General Patricia Walsh, a woman whose reputation for prosecuting corporate crime had survived 3 different gubernatorial administrations. Ms. Walsh, my name is Clara Hawthorne, and I have evidence of murder and conspiracy involving the Whitmore family in Cedar Hollow, Clara said without preamble. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Mrs. Hawthorne, that's a very serious accusation. What kind of evidence are you talking about? Audio recordings of William Whitmore planning the murder of his nephew. Documents proving 45 years of mining safety violations that killed my father and 3 other men. And genealogical records establishing legitimate claims to the Whitmore inheritance. Another pause, longer this time. Mrs. Hawthorne, I'm going to need to meet with you in person to examine this evidence. Are you somewhere safe?
For now.
But the local sheriff's department is compromised. Sheriff Morrison is on William Whitmore's payroll. I see. Can you meet me at the Federal Building in Lexington tomorrow morning? I'll have FBI agents there to ensure your safety. Clara felt a surge of relief. Federal involvement meant the case would be outside William's sphere of influence.
I'll be there.
But Ms. Walsh, there's something else you need to know. The baby they're claiming died in that car crash. He's alive. I've been protecting him. The silence that followed was so long, Clara thought the line had gone dead. Finally, Walsh spoke again, her voice carefully controlled. Mrs. Hawthorne, are you telling me you have the missing Whitmore heir? I'm telling you I have a baby whose own uncle tried to have him murdered, and I have the recording to prove it. Dear God, Mrs. Hawthorne, listen to me very carefully. Don't trust anyone in local law enforcement. Don't go anywhere alone. Can you get to Lexington safely? I'll find a way. After ending the call, Clara began the delicate process of preparing for what might be her final confrontation with the forces that had shaped her life. She gathered all the evidence, her father's documents, the recording device, the genealogical records, and packaged them carefully in waterproof containers. If something happened to her on the way to Lexington, she wanted to ensure the truth would survive, but she also made another decision, one that surprised her with its emotional weight. Opening the old trunk where she kept Thomas's belongings, Clara retrieved the letters he'd written to her during their courtship, the photographs from their wedding day, and the small wooden cross he'd carved during their first winter in the mountains. I'm finally going to finish what we started, she said aloud, as if Thomas could hear her across the decades. We came to these mountains to escape the corruption down below, but maybe it's time to go back and clean house. Sam watched her with those remarkable eyes as she packed their few belongings into a small bag. For all the danger that lay ahead, Clara felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. She was no longer running from her past or hiding from the world. She was finally moving toward something, justice, truth, and a future where Sam could grow up safe from the violence that had claimed his parents. Your mama and daddy are going to get justice, she told the baby as she changed his diaper. And your great-grandfather, my daddy, is finally going to rest easy knowing the truth came out. A sound from outside made Clara freeze. The rumble of multiple vehicles coming up her mountain road, moving fast and making no attempt at stealth. Through the window she could see a convoy of black SUVs climbing toward her cabin, kicking up clouds of dust in their wake. Clara's mind raced through her options. She could try to run, take Sam, and disappear deeper into the mountains where vehicles couldn't follow. But winter was coming, and a baby couldn't survive the harsh mountain weather without proper shelter and supplies. Instead, Clara made a choice that reflected 20 years of mountain living and a lifetime of accumulated wisdom. If William Whitmore wanted a confrontation, she would give him one, but on her terms, using every advantage the mountains could provide. She quickly activated the emergency beacon Thomas had installed years ago, a device connected to the State Emergency Services Network that would bring help to her remote location. Then she gathered Sam into his carrier, secured the evidence in a backpack, and moved to the defensive positions. She'd been planning in her mind for days. The cabin sat in a natural bowl, surrounded by thick, forest and rocky outcroppings that provided excellent cover for someone who knew the terrain. Clara had spent 20 years learning every tree, every boulder, every deer path within a mile of her home. She knew which routes would support a vehicle and which would trap unwary intruders in terrain they couldn't navigate. More importantly, she knew that William's men would be operating under the assumption that they were dealing with a helpless old woman and a baby, not a mountain-hardened survivor who'd been preparing for this moment her entire life. Clara positioned Sam's carrier in the root cellar beneath the cabin, a space that was both hidden and safe from gunfire. She kissed his forehead gently, whispering promises she intended to keep. "I'll be back for you, little one. Your uncle thinks he's dealing with some frightened hermit, but he's about to learn what mountain justice looks like." The first SUV crested the ridge and pulled into her clearing just as Clara took her position behind a fallen oak tree that commanded a clear view of the approach. Through her rifle scope, Thomas had taught her to shoot during their early years together. She could see James Davidson emerging from the lead vehicle, flanked by 4 men whose bearing and equipment marked them as professional soldiers. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Davidson called out, his voice carrying the false courtesy of a man who believed he held all the advantages. "We know you're here. We just want to talk about our previous offer." Clara remained silent, watching as the men spread out in a classic tactical formation. They were well trained and well equipped, but they were also operating in unfamiliar terrain against an opponent who had advantages they couldn't possibly understand. "The offer has increased," Davidson continued, moving closer to the cabin. $200,000 cash for the safe return of the child. "That's enough money to start over anywhere in the world." Still, Clara said nothing. Let them think she was cowering in the cabin while she observed their movements and planned her response. "Mrs. Hawthorne, I'm trying to be reasonable here." Davidson's voice took on a harder edge. "But my employer is running out of patience. We can do this the easy way, or we can do it the hard way." One of his men was circling toward the back of the cabin, moving with the confidence of someone who assumed his target was trapped inside. Clara tracked his movement through her scope, waiting for the right moment. "Last chance, Mrs. Hawthorne, come out with the baby, take the money, and this all ends peacefully." Clara's finger found the trigger as she made her final calculations. The emergency beacon would bring state police within 30 minutes, but that was 29 minutes too long if these men decided to storm the cabin. She had to buy time and protect Sam, which meant taking the offensive. "Davidson," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "I've got some bad news for you." The men spun toward the sound of her voice, trying to locate her position among the trees and shadows. "The baby you're looking for isn't here anymore," Clara continued, moving to a new position as soon as she finished speaking. "I sent him somewhere safe, somewhere your boss will never find him." "You're lying," Davidson replied, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "Am I? Check the cabin if you want. Go ahead and waste your time while the state police are on their way." This was a bluff. Clara couldn't be sure the emergency beacon had worked, and Sam was actually hidden beneath the very cabin Davidson's men were preparing to search. But she needed to create doubt, to make them second-guess their assumptions. "Boss," one of the mercenaries called out, "this could be a trap. Old mountain folk know these hills better than we do. She's one woman with a baby," Davidson snapped. "How dangerous could she be?" Clara smiled grimly as she settled into her next firing position. Davidson was about to find out exactly how dangerous a mountain woman could be when she was protecting something precious. "The boy's name is Samuel," Clara called out, playing her trump card. "Samuel Whitmore, rightful heir to $50 million. And I've got recordings of your boss planning his murder." The effect was immediate and electric. The mercenaries exchanged glances, their professional confidence shaken by the revelation that their target knew exactly who the baby was and what was at stake. "Kill her," Davidson ordered, abandoning all pretense of civility. "Find the baby and kill them both." "We clean this up now," Clara's first shot took out the tire of the nearest SUV, the explosion of rubber and air providing a harsh punctuation to Davidson's threat. Her second shot shattered the windshield of another vehicle, sending the mercenaries diving for cover behind whatever protection they could find. "Welcome to my mountain," Clara said softly, already moving to her next position as return fire. Splintered the trees where she'd been hiding moments before. The due battle for Sam's life and for justice that was, 45 years overdue, had finally begun. But this time, Clara Hawthorne wasn't running from her enemies. She was bringing the fight to them. Armed with a lifetime of mountain wisdom and a mother's unbreakable determination to protect the child she'd come to love as her own, William Whitmore had made the mistake of thinking money and violence could solve any problem. He was about to discover that some problems required a different kind of solution, the kind that could only be delivered by someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The firefight that erupted in Clara's mountain clearing was unlike anything Davidson's mercenaries had experienced. They were accustomed to urban operations, to enemies who fought from buildings and streets, not from ancient forests where every tree could hide a sniper and every shadow could conceal an ambush. Clara moved through the woodland like a ghost, using deer paths and natural cover that she'd known since childhood. 20 years of solitary mountain living had sharpened her senses and taught her to read the forest's moods, to know when a bird's call meant danger, and when a rustle in the underbrush was wind or wildlife or something more sinister. Her third shot took out another tire, effectively stranding 2 of the 3 vehicles in her clearing. The mercenaries were good. She could tell by the way they moved and communicated, but they were fighting on her ground now, and that gave her advantages no amount of training could overcome. "She's got us pinned down," one of the men shouted to Davidson, who had taken cover behind a disabled SUV. "It's one woman," Davidson snarled back, though his earlier confidence was clearly shaken.
"Flank her."
"Use your training." But flanking maneuvers that worked in open terrain became deadly traps in dense forest where Clara could appear and disappear at will. When 2 mercenaries tried to circle wide to her left, they found themselves stumbling through thorny underbrush and unstable footing that announced their position with every step. Clara's 4th shot wasn't aimed at equipment. The bullet took one of the flanking mercenaries in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into his partner. Both men went down hard, and their agonized cries echoed through the forest. "Jesus!" another mercenary whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "This isn't what we signed up for." "Hold your positions," Davidson commanded, but Clara could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The operation was falling apart, and he knew it. From her new position behind a granite outcropping, Clara had a clear view of the remaining vehicles and the men taking cover behind them. The emergency flare gun Thomas had given her years ago was tucked into her belt, a signal device that would mark her position for rescue helicopters, but could also serve a more immediate purpose. "Davidson," Clara called out, her voice carrying easily across the clearing. "I've got something your boss needs to hear." She activated the recording device, turning the volume up loud enough for everyone to hear William Whitmore's voice crackling through the mountain air. "The baby has to disappear permanently. I don't care how you do it, but make it look like an accident." The effect on the mercenaries was immediate. These were professional soldiers, not cold-blooded killers. They'd been told they were recovering a kidnapped child, not executing a baby on the orders of a man who wanted to inherit $50 million. "That's your boss," Clara continued, letting the recording play on. "That's William Whitmore ordering the murder of his own nephew. Is that really who you want to die for?" "Shut her up," Davidson screamed, but his men were already exchanging uncertain glances. The recording continued with devastating clarity. William's voice detailing the murder of Sam's parents and the planned elimination of anyone who might interfere with his inheritance. One of the mercenaries slowly stood up from behind his cover, his weapon lowered. "I didn't sign up to kill babies," he said quietly. "Get back down," Davidson ordered. But the man was already walking away from the clearing, heading back down the mountain road on foot. A second mercenary followed, then a third. Professional soldiers had codes of conduct, lines they wouldn't cross, no matter how much they were paid. Murdering innocent children wasn't part of their job description. Cowards, Davidson spat. But he was now alone, except for one remaining operative who seemed torn between loyalty and conscience. Clara used the distraction to move closer to the clearing, positioning herself where she could see Davidson clearly through her rifle scope. The man who had threatened Sam, who had tried to bribe and intimidate her, was now exposed and vulnerable. "It's over, Davidson," Clara called out. "Your men are gone, your vehicles are disabled, and the state police are on their way. Surrender now, and maybe you'll live long enough to testify against William Whitmore." Davidson's response was to raise his own weapon and fire wildly in her direction, the bullets chipping bark from trees and whining off stone, but coming nowhere close to their target. He was panicking now, a desperate man who knew his carefully planned operation had turned into a complete disaster. Clara's next shot was carefully aimed and precisely placed. The bullet struck Davidson's weapon, tearing it from his hands and leaving him stunned and defenseless in the middle of the clearing. "Last man!" Clara called to the remaining mercenary, who was crouched behind the final intact vehicle. "Your boss is down, your backup is gone, and you're alone on a mountain with a woman who's been preparing for this fight her whole life. What's it going to be?" The mercenary slowly stood up, his hands visible and empty. "I'm out," he said clearly. This job was supposed to be a simple recovery operation. Nobody said anything about murdering children or getting into firefights with civilians. He, too, began walking back down the mountain road, leaving Davidson alone and defeated in Clara's clearing. Clara emerged from the tree line, her rifle trained on Davidson as she approached. The man who had seemed so confident and threatening just minutes earlier now looked small and pathetic, clutching his injured hand and staring at her with undisguised fear. "Please," Davidson gasped. "I was just following orders. William Whitmore promised us $1 million to bring back the baby. Dead or alive?" Clara asked coldly. Davidson's silence was answer enough. Clara pulled the flare gun from her belt and fired it into the sky, the bright red signal climbing high above the mountains before exploding in a shower of sparks. If the emergency beacon hadn't worked, the flare would certainly attract attention from search and rescue teams in the area. "You're going to have a lot of explaining to do when the authorities get here," Clara said, keeping her rifle trained on Davidson. "I'd start thinking about how you want to tell your story." In the distance, she could hear the approaching sound of helicopter rotors, either state police or emergency services responding to her signals. Help was coming, and with it the opportunity to finally expose the crimes that had claimed so many innocent lives. But first, Clara needed to check on Sam. The battle was won, but the child who had started it all was still hidden beneath her cabin, waiting for the all-clear that would signal safety at last. As she backed toward her home, still keeping Davidson covered, Clara felt a surge of triumph mixed with exhaustion. 20 years of hiding were finally over. The mountain woman, who had fled the world in grief and fear, was about to emerge victorious, carrying evidence that would bring down one of the most corrupt families in Kentucky and ensure that an innocent child could grow up free from the violence that had claimed his parents. The helicopters were getting closer now, their distinctive sound echoing off the mountain walls. Justice was coming to the Whitmore family at last, delivered by a woman they had dismissed as unimportant and a baby they had tried to murder. Clara Hawthorne had finally come home. See? State police helicopter touched down in Clara's clearing 20 minutes later, disgorging a team of officers led by a tall woman in tactical gear who immediately took charge of the scene. Assistant Attorney General Patricia Walsh had kept her promise, bringing federal backup and enough firepower to handle whatever situation they might encounter. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Walsh called out, her weapon drawn but pointed safely away from Clara. "I'm Patricia Walsh. We spoke on the phone." Clara lowered her rifle and stepped into the open. relief flooding through her as she saw the official badges and unmarked vehicles that were now filling her mountain sanctuary. "The evidence is in my cabin," she said, "and the baby is safe." While federal agents secured Davidson and began documenting the scene, Clara led Walsh into her home and down to the root cellar where Sam had waited out the firefight. The baby was awake but calm, his remarkable eyes following Clara's face as she lifted him from his hiding place. "My God," Walsh breathed, looking at the child in Clara's arms. "He's really alive. The entire state has been looking for this baby. His name is Samuel," Clara said firmly. "Samuel Whitmore, and his uncle tried to have him killed for an inheritance. We're going to need to hear everything," Walsh said gently. "But first, let's get you both somewhere safe while we process this scene." Clara handed over the backpack containing all the evidence, her father's documents, the recording device, the genealogical records that proved her own family's connection to the Whitmore fortune. As Walsh examined the materials, her expression grew increasingly grim. "This is enough to bring down the entire Whitmore empire," Walsh said finally. "Mrs. Hawthorne, do you understand what you've uncovered here? This isn't just about one missing child. This is about decades of corporate crime, murder, and corruption." "I understand perfectly," Clara replied, rocking Sam gently as federal agents moved around them with professional efficiency. "My father died trying to expose these people 45 years ago. It's time they finally paid for their crimes." The next few hours passed in a blur of interviews, evidence collection, and legal procedures. Clara told her story repeatedly to different investigators, each time adding new details as they guided her through the events of the past week. The recording of William Whitmore's voice proved to be the keystone that held the entire case together, irrefutable, evidence of conspiracy to commit murder. But it was the genealogical documents that provided the most shocking revelation of all. When the federal investigators ran the DNA tests to confirm Sam's identity, they also tested Clara's blood to verify her family connection to the Whitmores. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Walsh said, approaching Clara as she fed Sam in the temporary command post they'd set up in her cabin. "The DNA results are back, and there's something you need to know." Clara looked up from the baby, seeing something in Walsh's expression that made her heart race. "What is it?" "You're not just distantly related to the Whitmore family," Walsh said carefully. "According to the genetic analysis, you're Samuel's great-aunt. Your great-grandmother and his great-great-grandfather were siblings." The implications hit Clara like a physical blow. She wasn't just protecting a random abandoned baby, she was protecting her own family. Sam was her blood relative, her kin, her responsibility not just by choice, but by the bonds of heredity that stretched back generations. "That means," Clara began, "that means you have legitimate legal standing to claim guardianship," Walsh finished. "And according to the genealogical records your father gathered, you also have a legitimate claim to a portion of the Whitmore estate." As if sensing the emotional weight of this revelation, Sam reached up with his tiny hand and grasped Clara's finger. The baby who had changed her life was truly hers now, not just by love and choice, but by blood and law. "William Whitmore is in custody," Walsh continued. "We arrested him an hour ago at his estate, along with Sheriff Morrison and 3 other local officials who were part of the conspiracy. The evidence you've provided is overwhelming." Clara felt tears she hadn't shed in 20 years sliding down her weathered cheeks. "And Sam? What happens to Sam?" "That's up to you," Walsh said gently. "As his closest living relative and the person who saved his life, you have first claim to guardianship. If you want him, Mrs. Hawthorne, he's yours." Clara looked down at the baby in her arms, the baby whose simple wooden rattle lay nearby, a toy she'd carved from mountain birch while waiting for the authorities to arrive. Sam was awake and alert, studying her face with those remarkable eyes that had captured her heart from the very first moment. "His name is Samuel Hawthorne Whitmore," Clara said firmly. "And yes, I want him. I want him more than anything in this world. Outside, the investigation continued as federal agents dismantled a criminal conspiracy that had lasted for decades. But inside Clara's cabin, justice had already been served in the most important way possible. An innocent child was safe, a family had been reunited, and love had triumphed over greed. The mountain woman, who had hidden from the world for 20 years, had finally found her way home, carrying with her the most precious cargo of all, a baby boy who would grow up knowing that he was wanted, protected and loved beyond measure. Clara Hawthorne had won more than a legal victory. She had won a family. 6 months later, Clara stood on the front porch of her mountain cabin, watching Sam take his first tentative steps across the worn wooden boards. At 8 months old, he was walking earlier than most babies, displaying the same determination that had carried him through the darkest moments of his young life. The spring air was sweet, with the scent of mountain laurel and wild honeysuckle, and for the first time in 20 years, Clara felt truly at peace. The legal proceedings had concluded just 2 weeks earlier with William Whitmore's conviction on multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and fraud. He would spend the rest of his life in federal prison, along with Sheriff Morrison and the other corrupt officials who had helped him cover up his crimes. The Whitmore empire, built on decades of blood money and criminal enterprise, had been dismantled piece by piece, its assets frozen, pending the resolution of multiple lawsuits. Clara had been awarded full custody of Sam, along with a settlement that acknowledged both her family's legitimate claim to the Whitmore fortune and the suffering they had endured at the hands of that corrupt dynasty. The money meant security for Sam's future, college funds, medical care, and the freedom to grow up without the shadow of want or fear, but more importantly, it meant validation. Her father's death had finally been acknowledged as murder, and the safety violations that killed him and 3 other men had been exposed to the world. The families of those miners, scattered though they were by time and distance, had received both financial compensation and the truth they'd been denied for 45 years. "Mama Clara," Sam said clearly, taking another wobbly step toward her outstretched arms. It was his favorite phrase, spoken with the perfect confidence of a child who had never known a moment of doubt about his place in the world. Clara caught him as he stumbled, lifting him into her arms and spinning him around until he giggled with delight. The child who had been abandoned in the wilderness had become the light of her life, transforming her mountain sanctuary from a place of exile into a true home. "That's right. Little man," she said, settling into the rocking chair that had become their evening ritual spot. "Mama Clara's got you, and she always will." The mail had brought news from the outside world, updates on the ongoing investigations, thank you letters from the families of her father's fellow miners, and invitations to speak at conferences about corporate accountability and justice. Clara had declined most of the public appearances, preferring the quiet satisfaction of knowing that truth had finally prevailed over corruption. But she had kept one letter, reading it so many times that the paper was soft with handling. It was from Maria Santos, the woman who had saved Sam from the car crash and hidden the recording device in his blanket. Maria had survived William's attempt to eliminate her, protected by the same federal investigation that had brought down the entire conspiracy. "I knew that baby deserved better than the death his uncle planned for him," Maria had written. "When I saw you on the news, holding him safe in your arms, I knew God had put him exactly where he belonged. Thank you for loving him the way his parents would have wanted." The letter was signed with a simple blessing. "May you both find the peace that comes from doing what's right, even when it's dangerous." Clara had found that peace, but she'd also found something more precious: purpose. The woman, who had spent 2 decades hiding from the world, had discovered that some things were worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect. As the sun set behind the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Clara began to hum the old lullaby her mother had sung to her long ago. Sam nestled against her chest, his breathing growing slow and steady as sleep claimed him. Thomas's wedding ring still hung around her neck, but it no longer felt like a weight anchoring her to the past. Instead, it felt like a bridge connecting the love she'd lost to the love she'd found, honoring her husband's memory while embracing the future that Sam represented. The new birth certificate that established Sam's legal identity lay framed on the mantel, next to photographs of her father and Thomas, and a small wooden cross that Sam loved to grasp during his feedings. The document was more than legal paperwork. It was a declaration of family, of belonging, of love that transcended blood and circumstance. Samuel Hawthorne Whitmore, Clara read softly from the certificate as she did every evening. Son of Charles and Elizabeth Whitmore, ward and beloved child of Clara Hawthorne, born into trouble but raised in love. Below the formal information, in the space reserved for additional notes, the clerk had written something that made Clara smile every time she saw it. Child found and claimed by the mountain woman who fought heaven and earth to keep him safe. As darkness settled over the mountains and the first stars appeared in the clear Kentucky sky, Clara carried the sleeping Sam inside to his crib, a real crib now, not a makeshift bed fashioned from a dresser drawer. The cabin that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with the sounds of life and laughter. The future as bright as the morning sun that would soon rise over their mountain home. Clara Hawthorne had finally come home from her long exile, carrying with her the most precious cargo of all, a child who would grow up knowing that love was stronger than greed, that justice was worth fighting for, and that sometimes the most unlikely heroes were the ones who changed the world. Outside, the mountain wind whispered through the trees with sounds of contentment and promise. The war was over, the truth had won, and tomorrow would bring new adventures for a mountain woman and the baby boy who had given her life meaning again. Some stories end with justice served and wrongs made right. This one ended with something even more powerful. A family forged by courage, strengthened by love, and blessed by the knowledge that they had fought the good fight and won.